But going on that like subject of trying to build a more equitable society, my next topic is something that I've actually not engaged with as much, and that's actually veganism. Full
Yes.
disclosure, I'm not a vegan, but for the longest time, I had been, you know, sort of against it in the sense of like I was critical of how inaccessible at least American commercialized versions of veganism can be, and the fact that like not all communities can have access to those products or quality produce. But over the last year or so, like my mentality has definitely changed, especially being on the foraging slash Asian cuisine side of TikTok. Um,
Okay.
and that's when I start to like really appreciate like the different ways that veganism can exist as a form of food sustainability just all over the world, and how veganism, looks very different outside of just a Western framework, and as a basis for community gardens and the fact that most of the problems that I had with veganism again really did stem mainly from that sort of Western capitalist version. However, I know that's not the only type of veganism. So I'm curious to actually hear your perspective and your take on veganism, as it pertains to being a vehicle for like racial justice or sustainability.
Oh my gosh, for sure. I think they're so interconnected. So another reason I love Squid Game, which there's just a long list of reasons, is because it really there's one line and one little section where they're making the connection of in oppression of people with the oppression of animals. So and I think, all oppression is interlinked. So whether it's racism, sexism, classism, they're all similar in the sense that there's an oppressive force and there's a power dynamic. And so it's the same thing with humans and animals. And there's questions of speciesism. So why do we let some animals sleep in our bed and other animals can't even turn around in their cages? They never see the light of day, things like that. And that's, connected to the way that we oppress people. So in Squid Game, towards the end, the winner's like, why are you doing this? Like, how could you? And Frontman is actually answering, well, you're our entertainment and, you bet on horses and you're our horses. And again, there's that justification. It's, well, you chose to play, you had an out, you didn't have to. Y'all could have come together and said, we don't want to do this shit no more, which they did one time. And so it's like justification. Well, some animals deserve to be treated like this. And some animals deserve not to be treated like this. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think there's a similar thing that happens with people. And it's like, well, some people, they deserve to clean toilets and never advance. Or, some people, they deserve to just be treated differently. Whether we're thinking about like immigration also, like
Mm-hmm.
some people don't deserve to live in the United States even.
Mm-hmm.
And so because we're like so much better than other places, air quotes. But like it's same with animals. So some deserve to be grown for slaughter, and others deserve to live pampered, charmed lives, like the cat that you may see sleeping behind me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's I find it to be from a fundamental like conceptual plane. um Veganism is like, I don't want to be part of this oppressive system. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to be part of a system that exploits animals for their bodies. I don't think those bodies belong to me. I think I don't want to be part of a system like even with dairy. Dairy is extremely harmful to the environment, just like the meat industry is harmful to the environment. I don't want to be part of a system where the workers who are slaughtering the cows or the pigs or chickens are under these horrible conditions. They are often undocumented folks. They sustain lots of injuries, whether in the meatpacking part or whether they're like working directly with the animals. So it's like on multiple levels, veganism jives better with my values, because there is a lot of racial injustice and gender injustice, and of course class injustice. Okay, race, class, gender, those are the three things sociologists focus on a lot. All those injustices are embedded in the meat industry, as well as like dairy industry. So it's I mean, of course it's going to be, because it's a capitalistic endeavor, and capitalism will always have those three tenets in it. But yeah, I think for racial justice also, when we're thinking about where our meat is coming from, like the hog farms in like North Carolina, for example, the people that live around those hog farms that are, you know, can't open their windows because the air is so awful from all the pig shit, essentially, that is just like in the air. It's being sprayed onto spinach, you know, like it's being used for other agriculture. The people who are in those areas are often low income, not white. In North Carolina specifically, a lot of them are Black. And so it's not just people who are consuming the items that are products of the meat industry, is people who are adjacent in some way, whether it's physical or they're working in the industry, or and the meat industry also accelerates climate change. So a lot of cows are raised in the rainforest, where they're just slashing and burning the rainforest, and then excuse me, cows are grazing there, and then they're slaughtered for like McDonald's. So there's a lot of excuse me, intricacies to the connections of injustices, not just for the animals, but for humans. And those connections I find to be pretty easy to make at this point in my life, but I know a lot of folks don't make those connections. And to your question about veganism and like how easy is it to do, it's I think there was definitely a time where it was a lot more difficult to have access to like a variety of foods. But you know, if you wanted to eat rice and beans, we could have always just eaten rice and beans. Like, it's very easy to buy those things as people in the United States. But now there's like all sorts of foods that are like meat substitutes, or just vegan or vegetarian like options. But yeah, I also find it interesting when people say it's inaccessible. I'm like, well, if you look around the world, like a lot of the things I eat, it's like non-American or like ethnic foods. So it's like Vietnamese food or Indian food. And because a lot of their diet is already vegan, and like coming from countries who didn't traditionally have access to a lot of meat. And meat used to be just like a flavoring, and not like a huge, like 1/3 of your plate, especially not every day. And so, yeah, I can go on and on about veganism, but I do think that those connections are really important. And I like how with that one line in Squid Game, it like really spoke to me. I was like, oh, I love that you make the connection between the animals and people. Yeah.
I'm glad that you said that, because, you know, I'll even admit, you know, I've always known that, as somebody who is an advocate for, you know, racial justice, and who's anti-capitalist, I know how horrible the meat industry is. You know, just even if you want to just talk about from a climate perspective, but then you want to go down into the layers of, you know, how these organizations employ people and underpay them, and, you know, who they source their labor from, and how they're able to exploit them, and the fact that they're able to treat these animals and put them in these conditions, and how so many of it is just, you know, given the okie dokie by like everybody up and down the corporate chain, you know. And so it's something that I almost feel like it's just this ticking time bomb, you know. I mean, even when it came to COVID sort of exposing how a lot of these farms started to get, you know, these problems. And so I I know this is something that I have to like work through on my own. Because even when you were just talking about how like, well, you know, there's in terms of accessibility, there's like plenty of cuisines and cultures that have been doing food. Like you're right. Like, you know, there's so many Indian places that have like all vegan menus, you know, and I think another big part of it that is sort of like I'm, you know, my own hypocrisy is colliding into, which is there is a big cultural and educational aspect that I think, especially in the United States, where I mean, you were talking about how this idea of, you know, it wasn't always the case that we had a big old pile of meat on our plate and then like a little like sides of veggies, like, you know, a leaf of spinach. But like, I think so much of it is also deeply rooted into sort of the fabric of food identity in America, and how so much of almost the American dream of what it means to be well fed is to have this feast, to have the big old turkey, the big old steak, you know. And I think like almost I almost feel like a lot of Americans in particular, I'm pretty sure that like I have a bias. I mean, I'm Filipino, and we also eat a lot of meat, so there's probably that too. But especially in the United States, like I almost feel like there's this sense of, you can't take away my meat the same way you can't take away my guns. You know, there's just like an aspect of it that's like deeply embedded in our sense of like my freedom to do this. You know, it is my right to do this. Oof. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of cracking open my own head on this, but yeah, I think that's I think that's such an important point, and you know, I'm sure that we could go on about veganism, but.
Well, that I will comment real quick is like meat is very much connected to masculinity too.
Yeah.
And that's like so insidious. And so that guns and meat connection and freedom, like all of that for me, when I hear you say that, speaks to our ideals of masculinity in the United States. And yeah, it's a good point. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack, I think, with our eating habits. Like, it's not enough to educate someone about a thing. It has to be like easy enough to change, and you have to be willing enough to change it into a habit. And culture makes it really hard to change like eating habits. But if it's accessible and it's easy enough and you have a willingness and desire to do it, then it can be something you can change. But yeah, it doesn't have to happen overnight. It is something that I think people can do gradually, and just generally reducing their meat or dairy consumption, and it will make you feel better. Like if you just eat half of the amount of things you eat in terms of meat and dairy, you will probably notice a difference. If you're supplementing with healthy vegetables and fruits and things like that.
Yeah, and I definitely think that you know, especially with just the you know, issue of food insecurity and the fact that so much of the way that we try to rely on feeding the folks who are struggling to get a meal every day, and how oftentimes our answer to that is to lean on, you know, America's you know, commercialized food industry as a remedy, instead of saying like, hey, maybe we should like build community gardens and like farms and like actually you know, develop fresh produce.